The Krill Military Academy was a testament to the elegant science of war. Its halls, carved from crystalline rock, echoed with the hum of advanced processors and the crisp, logical commands of its instructors. The Krill, a warrior race whose combat strategy was based on perfect data and precise, predictable outcomes, had perfected the art of conflict. For them, a weapon was a tool, and the deadliest one was simply the most powerful and efficient. Today's lecture was no different. The instructor, a six-limbed veteran named Commander Zyrax, was detailing the most fearsome weapons in the known galaxy. Holographic schematics of planet-cracking bombs, matter disintegration cannons, and bioengineered plagues flickered in the air. The young Krill Marines watched impassively, their combat algorithms running, calculating the effectiveness of each weapon. They were unmoved. They had seen these weapons in simulations 1,000 times. Seated at the back of the lecture hall, a quiet, weathered figure watched with a grim, knowing silence. Sergeant Major Graves was a Terran, a human advisor on loan to the Krill. His species was considered a biological oddity, a race of illogical, emotional beings whose only contribution to galactic war was a chaotic, unpredictable ferocity. The Krill, with their serene logic, had little use for his unpredictable insights. When Commander Zyrax concluded his lecture, a single synthesized cheer echoed through the hall. "We have seen the full spectrum of our military might, Marines. We have catalogued the most fearsome tools of war. You are now prepared to face the most dangerous weapons in the galaxy." Graves stood up, his human form a stark contrast to the crystalline elegance of the Krill. His movements were not fluid. They were deliberate, with the weight of 1,000 battles behind them. With all due respect, Commander Graves's voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "You're wrong." The Krill Marines turned to look at him, their multifaceted eyes showing a flicker of condescension. Zyrax turned as well, his form rippling with offense. "Sergeant Major, our weapons are the pinnacle of destructive science. What could possibly be more dangerous?" Graves didn't answer. He simply reached into the tattered pocket of his uniform and pulled out a small metallic object. The Krill Marine scanners registered it as a primitive Terran tool, a ceremonial device used to create light and heat. It was considered a quaint, useless trinket. One of the young Marines projected a thought packet of pure, crystalline amusement. Graves ignored them all. He held the object, a well-worn Terran lighter, in his calloused hand. With a simple flick of his thumb, a small, vibrant flame erupted from its tip. The Krill flinched, not in fear but in surprise. They expected a display of power, a detonation, a show of force. What they saw was a flickering, uncontrollable flame, a beautiful but utterly chaotic thing. Graves's eyes, however, held a chilling, distant terror. He stared at the small dancing fire as if it were a living thing, a primal entity. "You have catalogued the most powerful weapons," he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "But you have forgotten the most dangerous. The most dangerous weapon isn't the one with the most power, it's the one you can't control. The most dangerous weapon is chaos." The Krill Marines stood motionless, their multifaceted eyes locked on the small, flickering flame. The silence was broken by Commander Zyrax, his voice a crisp, synthesized command. "Sergeant Major, your assessment is flawed. Fire is a primitive chemical reaction. It is easily contained, requires a constant fuel source, and its effects are wholly predictable. A plasma rifle, by contrast, is a targeted burst of controlled energy. It can be aimed with perfect accuracy, its destructive radius calculated to the micrometer. There is no comparison." Graves flicked the lighter shut, the small audible click echoing in the sterile silence. "That's where you're wrong, Commander. You're looking at the wrong kind of weapon. You're thinking of a tool you point at an enemy. I'm talking about a force you unleash on an environment." He began to walk through the silent, unmoved ranks of the Krill Marines. "Let's talk about Terran history. A long, long time ago, our ancestors learned to use fire. We didn't learn to control it. We learned to live with it. We understood that a fire started in one place could become a wildfire, a single living entity that moves on its own, creating its own winds and consuming everything in its path. It ignores tactical lines. It doesn't care about your armor. It doesn't discriminate between a soldier and a civilian." A young Marine, its form shifting with a mixture of academic condescension and curiosity, projected a question. "Fire is a known variable. It can be extinguished with water, inert gases, or by removing its fuel source. It is not chaos." Graves stopped and turned to face the Marine. His face was a road map of old scars and grim experience. "That's the problem. You think you can control it. You're talking about putting out a bonfire. I'm talking about starting a war. A plasma blast creates a single, contained whole. A biological plague can be quarantined, but fire, a fire is a disease you unleash upon the land itself. You light a small spark in a forest, and a continent burns. It creates smoke that blinds your senses. It creates an atmosphere of pure terror that breaks down the morale of your troops. He pulled the lighter out again, holding it up for all to see. This isn't a weapon, it's a key. The key to unleashing a chain reaction of destruction that is exponential and utterly unpredictable. You can calculate the damage of your plasma rifle. You can't calculate the damage of this. As he spoke, the Krill Marines began to run new simulations in their minds. They visualized a small, flickering flame on a dry field. They watched in horror as their internal projectors, based on Graves's illogical premise, showed the fire spreading, consuming everything in its path, creating a maelstrom of destruction that defied their tactical models. Their serene, logical minds began to falter. They saw a weapon that could not be outsmarted, only unleashed. They had faced bombs and lasers without a flicker of fear, but now they stared at the tiny lighter in Graves's hand with a new, profound, and intellectual terror. The Krill Marines' internal processors whirred, running 1,000 new simulations based on Graves's terrifying premise. They had always thought of war in terms of lines and vectors, of a logical exchange of force. Graves had shown them a weapon that was a force of nature, a thing that did not care about their rules or their battle formations. The lecture hall, which had been a place of sterile, elegant learning, was now a hall of silent, intellectual dread. Commander Xerax, a master of 1,000 battles, was the first to recover. Sergeant Major, his voice was a low hum, but it contained a tremor of genuine curiosity. We have procedures for wildfires. We use inert gases. We create fire breaks. They are a predictable, if costly, nuisance. You are speaking of a theoretical concept. Graves shook his head, a grim smile on his face. You're still not seeing it, Commander. You're thinking of a fire on your planet, in your controlled environment. I'm talking about a fire on a planet that doesn't have your pristine, sterile conditions. I'm talking about a fire that gets into the air ducts of your city. A fire that you can't see. He then projected a new schematic, a simple diagram of a Terran city. He showed them how the fire could get into the electrical systems, into the flammable gases, and into the very structural integrity of the buildings. He showed them how a single spark could lead to a cascading failure of an entire urban network. He showed them how a single, contained flame could become a ghost, a thing that was everywhere at once, unseen, unheard, and utterly unstoppable. The Krill Marines' processors seized. This was a new kind of terror. They had prepared for an enemy they could see, an enemy they could track, an enemy they could calculate. Graves was speaking of an invisible enemy, a weapon that was everywhere at once, a thing that was a part of the very infrastructure they had designed to be perfect. Graves walked to the front of the lecture hall, his hand still holding the small, primitive lighter. He no longer looked like an uneducated brute. He looked like a prophet, a man who had seen a kind of hell they could not even imagine. You think you're prepared for a war of logic, he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper, but you're not. You're not prepared for a war of chaos. And the most dangerous weapon of all is a weapon that can create chaos where there was once order. He then told them a story, a Terran myth from a time before they had even reached the stars. A story of a small spark that started an entire war, not because of its destructive power, but because of the fear it created, the panic it unleashed, and the complete, illogical chaos it caused. He told them of a single, flickering flame that changed the course of history, not by burning an enemy, but by burning a truth. The Krill Marines, trained to be logical and serene in the face of any threat, felt their logical processes seize. They had been taught that war was a science. Graves had just shown them that it was a force of nature, a thing that could not be controlled, only unleashed. The lecture hall was filled with the silent, terrified hum of 1,000 processing units. The Krill Marines had faced the most fearsome weapons in the galaxy, but they had never encountered a threat that defied all logic. They had prepared for power. Graves had shown them chaos. Let's make this practical. Graves's voice was a low, chilling rasp. He pulled up a holographic schematic of a typical Krill military outpost. It was a masterpiece of logical design, automated defenses, redundant power systems, and perfectly orchestrated patrols. The Krill Marines, who had memorized every inch of its blueprints, felt a surge of professional pride. Marine, Graves pointed to a young soldier in the front row. Tell me how you would assault this fortress with a matter disintegration cannon. Give me your tactical analysis. The Marine's voice was crisp and confident. It laid out a perfect plan, a precise strike on the primary energy conduit, followed by a series of perfectly timed flanking maneuvers to take out the automated defenses. It was a flawless, logical strategy. Perfect, Graves said, a grim smile on his face. Now, tell me how you would assault it with this. He held up the small, simple lighter. The Marines' processors faltered. The very question was an absurdity. The outpost was a fortress of steel and logic. The lighter was a useless trinket. There was no logical way to connect the two. Graves didn't wait for an answer. He began to narrate his own primitive tactical plan. You wouldn't use a cannon. You'd use a single illogical element. You'd find a way to get one Terran into the fortress. He wouldn't have a weapon. He'd find a flaw in your perfect design. A vent, an unguarded maintenance shaft, a sewer system, something you considered too primitive to worry about. He would get in. He would find a small, ignored flaw, a gas line with a minute leak, a bundle of old wires with frayed insulation, and he would use this. He flicked the lighter, and the small, vibrant flame erupted. He wouldn't create a big explosion. He wouldn't level the base. That's what you're prepared for. He would just start a small fire. A minor electrical fire in a forgotten utility corridor. The Krill ran a simulation of the event. The minor fire caused a single sensor to malfunction. The system, designed to be perfect, rerouted its power, leading to a temporary hiccup in the primary defense grid. That hiccup was enough. The Krill, who were trained to fight a perfect, logical war, would be thrown into chaos. Their perfect system was not built to handle an illogical event. A small fire, a tiny, almost insignificant event, would cascade into a breakdown of command, a malfunction of their automated systems, and a complete loss of control. You see, Graves concluded, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. The deadliest weapon isn't the one that can destroy a planet. The deadliest weapon is a simple Terran and a lighter. You are prepared to fight a perfect war. We are prepared to bring a war of chaos to your perfect front door. The Krill Marines stared at the lighter in Graves's hand. It was no longer a trinket. It was a key to a kind of war they had never prepared for, a war that defied their very existence. They had always believed that their perfect, logical systems were their greatest strength. Graves had just shown them that they were their greatest, and most terrifying, weakness. The holographic outpost faded, leaving the Krill Marines in a state of silent, intellectual collapse. Their processors, designed for perfect calculations, had been corrupted by a single, terrifying truth. Their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Sergeant Major Graves, with a simple lighter, had shown them that all their training, all their technology, and all their logic were useless against a weapon that defied every known principle of war. Later that cycle, in a private antechamber, Commander Xerax confronted Graves. The Krill's demeanor was no longer one of a superior officer. His posture was that of a student, his voice a low hum filled with a profound sense of defeat. Sergeant Major, he projected, I have run the simulations. Your theory, it is sound. My men are unprepared for a threat that cannot be calculated. We are prepared to fight a war of power. We do not know how to fight a war of chaos. Graves, who was quietly polishing the chrome of his lighter, looked up. His eyes held the weary wisdom of a being who had seen the worst of both logical and illogical warfare. You can't, he said, his voice a low rasp. You don't fight chaos. You embrace it. Xerax's multifaceted eyes flickered in confusion. Elaborate. You fight with data, Graves explained. You fight with algorithms, with perfect plans. Your every move is a predictable variable in a larger equation. That's why you are vulnerable. You're predictable. We are not. We are the ultimate variable. You have never encountered a species that fights with illogical emotion. A Terran doesn't just pull a trigger. They do it out of rage, or fear, or because a loved one was harmed. That isn't in your data. It can't be. He held up the lighter again, its chrome gleaming in the sterile light. This isn't just a tool to start a fire. It's a key. The key to unleashing the unpredictable, illogical genius of an entire species. The deadliest part of this weapon isn't the flame it creates, it's the human who holds it. Graves then presented a final, horrifying demonstration. He projected an image of a tranquil, peaceful Terran village, a place of simple life and emotional bonds. You are trained to fight a war of strategy. But what would happen, he asked, his voice filled with a chilling, theatrical terror, if a single Krill Marine, full of illogical rage, and a desire for chaos, were to show up here? What would they do? The Krill commander recoiled. The very thought was an absurdity. Their training had purged them of all illogical emotion, but Graves pushed the point. He explained that a single act of irrationality could lead to an entire species unleashing a kind of terrifying primal chaos that their logical, serene minds could never comprehend. "We have spent our entire history fighting our own illogical demons," Graves said. "We have lived in the shadow of our own unpredictable nature. And because of that, we have become masters of chaos. You have spent your entire history trying to perfect a logical existence, and because of that, you are utterly helpless in the face of a simple, illogical threat." Zyrax looked at the human not as a primitive, but as a master of a form of warfare he could never comprehend. He now saw the humans with a new, profound sense of respect and, most importantly, fear. The quiet antechamber felt cold, the sterile air now heavy with a new, unsettling knowledge. Commander Zyrax had been a master of 1,000 logical battles, but Sergeant Major Graves had just shown him a single, illogical truth that had undone his entire worldview. The deadliest weapon was not a bomb, it was a human and a simple tool that represented their terrifying, chaotic nature. Graves, sensing the end of his lesson, stood up. He didn't offer a final piece of tactical advice or a new combat doctrine. Instead, he gave the commander a chilling piece of wisdom. "You don't fight us with logic, Commander. You can't. You have to fight us with a new kind of weapon. You have to understand our chaos." Graves pulled up a final holographic schematic. It wasn't of a weapon or a fortress. It was a cross-section of a Terran brain, a swirling, messy network of illogical emotions and primal instincts. "This is your enemy," Graves said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You're not fighting our soldiers. You're fighting our poetry. You're fighting our love for our families. You're fighting our rage. You're fighting our illogical genius. You need to understand that the things we do in war aren't just for a tactical advantage. We do them for honor, for vengeance, for all the illogical reasons you cannot comprehend." Graves turned to leave, his form a silent, walking testament to a kind of warfare that had long been forgotten by the logical races of the galaxy. "I hope your species never has to face mine in a real war," he said, his voice devoid of any arrogance, only a weary kind of truth. "Because you won't be fighting an army, you'll be fighting a force of nature, and you'll lose." Months later, the Krill Military Academy was still a place of logical perfection. But a quiet, unsettling change had taken root. The training manuals were still filled with complex algorithms and perfect tactical plans. But a new section had been added. It was a mandatory course for all new recruits, titled Terran Unpredictability. The recruits were forced to study ancient Terran history, not for its military data but for its chaos. They were made to listen to Terran music, to read Terran poetry, and to watch Terran holodramas, all in an attempt to understand the illogical concepts of love, loyalty, and rage that fueled their destructive genius. Commander Zyrax, now an instructor of the course, stood in the lecture hall. He held a training-grade replica of a Terran lighter. He flicked it open, and a small, vibrant, but utterly contained flame erupted. The new recruits, who had been taught about planet-cracking bombs and matter disintegration cannons, stared at the flame with a newfound, profound terror. They looked at it not as a source of light, but as a key to a kind of war they knew they could not win with logic alone. The most dangerous weapon in the galaxy wasn't a bomb. It was a simple, primitive object that represented a kind of terrifying, beautiful, and utterly chaotic soul. It was a lighter in the hand of a human,